Every morning begins with a decision most people never realize they are making, before the noise, before the notifications, before the world tells you what matters today. There is a quiet battlefield inside your mind, and on that battlefield, two forces are already waiting. One is habit, the other is intention. Habit whispers the same familiar script it has repeated for years. Check your phone. Review yesterday's mistakes. Worry about what might go wrong. Compare yourself to someone who seems further ahead. Rehearse the problems before they even arrive. It feels automatic because it is. Neural pathways built through repetition now fire without asking your permission, but intention stands there too, quieter, steadier. It does not shout. It does not panic. It waits for you to claim it. The Stoics understood this morning moment with ruthless clarity. Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome, wrote his reflections not in comfort, but in the midst of war, betrayal, plague, and political tension. He reminded himself each dawn that the quality of his life would be determined not by events, but by the quality of his thoughts. He knew that before he ruled an empire, he had to rule his mind. And that ruling began in the morning. Most people wake up and immediately surrender sovereignty. They allow headlines to shape their mood. They let other people's opinions enter before their own convictions have formed. They begin the day reacting instead of choosing. And once you begin in reaction, the pattern repeats. One notification becomes 10. One worry becomes a chain of catastrophes. One comparison becomes a quiet erosion of self-worth. By noon, you are no longer directing your day. You are surviving it. But what if the first words you speak each morning are not just words? What if they are commands to your nervous system, instructions to your subconscious, architecture for your identity? Science confirms what ancient philosophy intuited. Neuroplasticity teaches that repeated thoughts strengthen specific neural circuits. The brain adapts to what it practices. Practice fear, and fear becomes efficient. Practice doubt, and doubt becomes default. Practice intentional thought, and the brain reorganizes around clarity. The first internal dialogue of the day is not trivial. It is priming, it is rehearsal, it is direction setting. The Stoics did not use modern neuroscience terms, but they understood conditioning. Epictetus taught that we are disturbed not by events, but by our judgments about events. That judgment is formed in thought. Thought is shaped by repetition, and repetition begins the moment you wake. If you do not choose your first thoughts, they will be chosen for you by habit, culture, or unresolved fear. This is why the morning matters. Not because it is mystical, but because it is foundational. Before you speak to anyone else, you are speaking to yourself. Before you perform for the world, you are forming your identity. And identity is not built in grand gestures. It is built in small, repeated declarations about who you are and how you will move through the day. This is not about pretending life is easy. It is not about forcing optimism. It is about discipline. It is about deciding that your inner world will not be dictated by external noise. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." That strength does not appear automatically. It is practiced. It is rehearsed. It is spoken into being. Imagine waking tomorrow and resisting the automatic reach for your phone. Imagine sitting still for a single minute. No scrolling, no reacting, just awareness. In that silence, your mind is impressionable. It is waiting. And instead of feeding it fear, you feed it direction. Instead of replaying yesterday's failures, you choose an intentional truth. You are not trying to control the world. You are training the self who will walk into it. Most people believe transformation requires dramatic change. A new job, a new city, a new relationship. But the Stoics would argue that transformation begins far earlier. It begins in thought, in perception, in the private language you use when no one else is listening. Because that language determines whether you face the day as a victim of circumstance or as an author of response. This first moment each morning is sacred territory. It is the only time of day when the world has not yet claimed you. If you give it away immediately, you spend the rest of the day trying to recover control. But if you claim it deliberately, you step into the day anchored, not drifting. Over the next sections, we will examine 5 declarations that rewire how you see challenge, time, worth, and control. They are not magic phrases, they are anchors. Identity statements, repetitions that reshape the architecture of your mind. But before we go further, understand this: the battle is not out there. It is here, in the silent seconds before your first distraction. Win the morning and you strengthen the day. Strengthen the day and you reshape the life. Tomorrow, when the sun rises and the world waits for your reaction, pause, breathe, and remember that the first voice you hear should be your own. Life will test you today. That is not pessimism, it is reality. A message will arrive that you did not want to receive. A plan will shift without your permission. Someone will misunderstand you. Something you worked for will move slower than you hoped. The question is never whether difficulty appears. The question is, who decides what happens next inside you? This is where the first declaration becomes more than a phrase. I choose my response. These 4 words separate the reactive from the disciplined. Most people live in reaction. Something happens and emotion immediately takes control. Anger rises and becomes words. Fear rises and becomes avoidance. Disappointment rises and becomes self-doubt. There is no pause, no examination, just a chain reaction that feels automatic. And after enough repetition, it is automatic. Neural pathways become efficient. Trigger leads to emotion. Emotion leads to behavior. Behavior reinforces identity. This is just how I am, they say, unaware that what they call personality is often just unexamined habit. The Stoics rejected this unconscious living. Epictetus taught that between what happens to you and how you respond lies your freedom. That space, however small, is where dignity lives. If you lose that space, you lose yourself. If you protect that space, you become unshakable. Choosing your response does not mean you feel nothing. It does not mean you suppress anger or pretend disappointment does not sting. It means you recognize emotion as information, not instruction. Anger may tell you that a boundary was crossed. Fear may tell you that something important is at stake. Sadness may tell you that you cared deeply, but emotion does not get to dictate action unless you allow it to. Consider a practical example. You receive criticism at work. Your immediate impulse is defensiveness. You want to interrupt. You want to justify. You want to protect your image. That impulse is natural. But if you have practiced the morning declaration, something different happens. A pause appears, just a breath. In that breath, you remember, I choose my response. Instead of reacting, you listen fully. You assess whether the criticism holds truth. You respond calmly, either correcting misinformation or accepting feedback without collapse. The difference is not the event. The difference is the space you created. Or imagine conflict in a relationship. A sharp comment lands. The old pattern would escalate. Voice rises. Words become weapons. Both sides try to win. But when you have trained your mind to choose response, you interrupt the escalation. You lower your tone. You ask a clarifying question instead of launching an accusation. You protect the relationship instead of your pride. That choice is power. Marcus Aurelius ruled during chaos. War pressed at the borders. Plague devastated cities. Political betrayal surrounded him. He could not control those events, but he could control his internal posture toward them. He wrote reminders to himself daily because he understood that leadership begins within. You may not command an empire, but you command your reactions, and that command shapes your character. Here is the deeper truth. If you do not choose your response, someone else will choose it for you. Their insult will control your mood. Their approval will control your confidence. Their delay will control your peace. You become externally governed, and external governance always leads to instability. Choosing your response reclaims authorship. It says, I am not a leaf blown by every wind. It says, circumstances influence me, but they do not define me. It is not about dominance. It is about discipline. The discipline to pause, the discipline to think before speaking, the discipline to align behavior with values rather than impulses. Practically, this means building micro-habits of pause. When triggered, breathe once before answering. When frustrated, wait 10 seconds before typing the message. When disappointed, ask yourself one question: what response serves my long-term character best? Over time, this practice strengthens new neural pathways. Reaction slows. Reflection strengthens. The identity shifts. You stop saying, "That's just how I am." You begin living as someone who chooses. And the power of this is cumulative. One chosen response does not change your life. 100 do, 1,000 do. Character is built in these moments, not in grand speeches, but in quiet decisions under pressure. Each morning when you say, "I choose my response," you are not making a wish. You are setting a standard. You are reminding your mind that no matter what the day delivers, you retain authority over your behavior. And authority over behavior is authority over destiny. Because your life is not the sum of what happens to you, it is the sum of how you respond to what happens to you. Speak it tomorrow. "I choose my response." Then prove it when the test arrives. Discomfort is not a warning sign that something has gone wrong. Most of the time it is evidence that something important is happening, yet your nervous system does not interpret it that way. It interprets discomfort as danger, as threat, as something to escape immediately. That instinct once protected you from physical harm. Now it protects you from growth. And that protection is slowly suffocating your potential. When you wake up and say, "Growth lives here," you are redefining the meaning of discomfort. You are retraining your mind to stop labeling every stretch as a threat. Because the moment you feel challenged, uncertain, exposed, or humbled, your old identity is being confronted. And identity resists change. Think about the last time you attempted something new, a new responsibility at work, a difficult conversation you avoided for months, a creative project you finally allowed yourself to begin. The first experience was not confidence. It was tension, doubt, a subtle voice saying, "You're not ready." That voice feels protective, but it is only protecting the version of you that wants to remain unchanged. Growth lives exactly at the edge of that tension. Seneca wrote that difficulty strengthens the mind as labor strengthens the body. No one expects muscles to grow without resistance. Yet we expect our character to evolve without friction. We expect confidence without risk, discipline without discomfort, clarity without confusion. That is not how transformation works. When you declare growth lives here, you stop interpreting friction as failure. You begin to interpret it as construction. The awkwardness you feel when learning a new skill is not proof that you lack talent. It is proof that neural pathways are forming. The fear before a courageous decision is not proof that you are weak. It is proof that you are stepping beyond what is familiar. The exhaustion after sustained effort is not collapse. It is expansion. Most people retreat the moment discomfort appears. They leave the gym when muscles burn. They abandon projects when progress slows. They exit conversations when emotions rise. Not because they are incapable, but because they misinterpret the signal. They believe pain equals wrong direction. The disciplined mind understands that pain often signals the right direction. Consider how this applies emotionally. Growth is not only skill-based, it is relational, psychological, moral. Setting a boundary for the first time feels terrifying because it disrupts a pattern. Saying no when you are used to overcommitting feels selfish because you have equated self-sacrifice with worth. Walking away from a situation that diminishes you feels lonely because you are detaching from familiarity. In each of these cases, discomfort is present, and in each of these cases, growth lives exactly there. Epictetus did not become resilient by living in comfort. He was born enslaved, stripped of autonomy, subjected to hardship. Yet within those constraints, he discovered something unbreakable. His body could be controlled. His circumstances dictated, but his interpretation remained his own. He chose growth inside limitation. That choice transformed suffering into wisdom. You may not face chains, but you face resistance daily. The question is whether you interpret it as injustice or invitation. When you say growth lives here in the morning, you are pre-deciding how you will interpret the day's friction. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" you begin asking, "What is this shaping in me?" That shift changes everything. It moves you from victim to participant, from passive recipient of stress to active builder of strength. This does not mean you romanticize suffering. Some pain is real and undeserved. Some losses are devastating. Stoicism is not denial. It is orientation. Even in genuine hardship, the question remains, will this diminish me or deepen me? You cannot control the event, but you can control whether it adds wisdom or only resentment. Practically, this means leaning into the edge rather than retreating from it. When something feels challenging but aligned with your values, stay. When effort feels heavy but meaningful, continue. When fear arises around something that matters, do not automatically interpret it as a stop sign. Interpret it as growth's threshold. Repetition rewires perception. Each time you experience discomfort and stay instead of escape, you teach your brain a new association. Discomfort equals development. Challenge equals strengthening. Fear equals expansion. Over time, your tolerance for growth increases. What once felt overwhelming becomes manageable. What once felt impossible becomes normal. And slowly, your identity shifts from someone who avoids discomfort to someone who seeks development. That is the transformation. You stop chasing comfort as your highest priority. You begin chasing alignment, purpose, expansion. You recognize that the most valuable parts of you were built in moments you once wanted to quit. Say it tomorrow before the day begins. Growth lives here. Say it when anxiety rises before a presentation. Say it when a conversation becomes uncomfortable but necessary. Say it when your effort feels insufficient. Each time you say it, you are reminding yourself that friction is not your enemy. It is your forge, and everything strong is forged under heat and pressure. Your mind is rarely where your body is. It is either wandering backward into regret or racing forward into imagined futures. Almost never does it rest fully in the only place where your power exists, this moment. When you wake up and say, "Today matters most," you are reclaiming your attention from two thieves, yesterday and tomorrow. Yesterday carries ghosts, conversations you wish you handled differently, opportunities you missed, versions of yourself you outgrew but still judge. The mind replays these memories as if repetition could rewrite them. It cannot. All it can do is drain energy from the present. Regret feels productive because it simulates correction, but it produces nothing except emotional fatigue. Tomorrow carries illusions, deadlines, outcomes, hypothetical scenarios your brain constructs in vivid detail. Anxiety masquerades as preparation, but most of what you rehearse never happens. And even when it does, it rarely unfolds the way you predicted. You suffer twice, once in imagination, once in reality. Meanwhile, today waits unnoticed. Marcus Aurelius disciplined his thinking around this truth. He reminded himself to confine his awareness to the present task, not because the future lacked importance, but because effective action is only possible now. You cannot improve yesterday. You cannot act in tomorrow. You can only decide what you do with this hour, this breath, this conversation. When you say today matters most, you narrow your focus deliberately. Instead of asking, "How will I solve everything this week?" you ask, "What deserves my attention in this moment?" Instead of replaying a mistake from 5 years ago, you ask, "What choice aligns with my values right now?" That shift reduces overwhelm instantly. Overwhelm is rarely about the present. It is about accumulation, stacking imagined problems into one heavy mental pile. The disciplined mind disassembles the pile. It handles what is in front of it. Then the next thing, then the next. This is not avoidance. It is strategic attention. Consider how often you live divided. You sit with someone you care about, but your thoughts are reviewing work. You work on a task, but your mind drifts to something you said yesterday. You attempt to rest, but your brain projects into next month. Divided attention fragments experience, and fragmented experience weakens performance. When you anchor in today, your effectiveness increases. Presence sharpens perception. It deepens relationships. It reduces error. It strengthens decision-making. Anxiety decreases because your mind is no longer juggling time frames it cannot control. This does not mean you ignore planning. Planning happens in the present too. But planning is different from worrying. Planning is structured, intentional, time-bound. Worry is repetitive and unproductive. When you say today matters most, you are choosing structured action over scattered rumination. There is another dimension to this. Identity is built daily, not in dramatic breakthroughs, but in repeated present choices. You do not become disciplined by imagining a disciplined future. You become disciplined by choosing a disciplined action today. You do not become confident by reliving past failures. You become confident by executing a small, courageous act now. Each day is a self-contained unit. Seneca described life as a series of individual days. If you treat each day as complete in itself, you begin living intentionally rather than postponing your life. Many people delay fulfillment. I'll rest when this is done. I'll feel proud when I reach that milestone. I'll be happy once everything stabilizes. But life does not stabilize permanently. There is always another goal, another responsibility, another demand. If today does not matter, nothing ever will. When you adopt today matters most as a morning declaration, you shift from postponement to participation. You stop living in rehearsal. You start living in performance. This day, ordinary as it may appear, is your life. Not a preview, not a warm-up, the real thing. Practically, this means simplifying your focus. What is one meaningful action today that aligns with who you want to become? Do that fully. What is one relationship that deserves presence? Show up completely. What is one habit that strengthens your character? Execute it deliberately. Leave tomorrow to tomorrow. Let yesterday rest. The present is not glamorous. It is quiet, sometimes repetitive, sometimes uncomfortable, but it is powerful, because it is the only place transformation occurs. Over time, anchoring in today builds momentum. Momentum builds identity. Identity shapes destiny, all through repeated present alignment. Say it tomorrow before distraction claims you. Today matters most. Let it pull you out of mental time travel. Let it center you in what is actionable. Let it remind you that this day, imperfect, unfinished, real, is enough to work with. And from that clarity move. There is a quiet belief running beneath almost every decision you make. It whispers that you will be enough when you achieve more, when you earn more, when you fix what feels flawed, when someone finally validates you. Until then, it tells you to keep striving, keep proving, keep performing. This belief feels motivating, but it is exhausting, because the finish line keeps moving. When you wake up and say, "I am enough," you are not declaring perfection. You are declaring sufficiency. You are separating worth from performance. You are refusing to let productivity determine identity. Most people never question the measuring system they use against themselves. It was installed early through comparison, praise tied only to achievement, criticism tied to mistakes, subtle signals that love must be earned. Over time, striving becomes survival. You begin to believe that rest must be justified, that boundaries require apology, that saying no risks losing belonging. The result is chronic tension. Even success feels temporary because it does not solve the underlying fear of insufficiency. It only delays it. The Stoics approached value differently. Epictetus taught that your worth lies in your capacity for reason and virtue, not in external outcomes. External things, status, wealth, approval, are unstable. They change with circumstance. If your identity depends on them, your stability disappears with them. But your character, your intentions, your effort, those remain within your control. That is where worth lives. When you internalize "I am enough," your behavior changes in subtle but powerful ways. You stop over-explaining yourself to gain approval. You stop chasing every opportunity just to feel relevant. You stop tolerating disrespect simply to avoid rejection. You begin making decisions based on alignment rather than validation. This is not arrogance. It is grounded self-respect. Arrogance inflates. Enoughness stabilizes. Arrogance demands superiority. Enoughness accepts humanity. You can acknowledge your weaknesses without collapsing into self-rejection. You can pursue growth without framing your current self as defective. Growth becomes expansion, not repair. This distinction matters. When growth is driven by fear of inadequacy, it produces anxiety and burnout. When growth is driven by curiosity and purpose, it produces fulfillment. Consider how often you compare your progress to someone further along. You measure your beginning against their middle. You ignore context, timing, circumstance. Comparison erodes sufficiency. It keeps you in deficit thinking. But identity is not a race. Development unfolds at different speeds. When you say, "I am enough," you exit the race mentality. You focus on trajectory, not position. There is another layer, the internal critic, that voice that magnifies mistakes and minimizes achievements. It believes harshness equals discipline. But constant self-criticism does not produce excellence. It produces paralysis. Sustainable discipline is rooted in respect, not contempt. When you anchor in enoughness, you do not silence the critic entirely. You simply refuse to let it define reality. You evaluate mistakes objectively. You correct course. You move forward, without attaching your entire identity to one imperfection. Marcus Aurelius, despite ruling an empire, reminded himself of his humanity. He did not seek to be superhuman. He sought to be virtuous within limitation. Accepting limitation does not reduce value. It grounds it. You are allowed to be incomplete and still worthy. You are allowed to be learning and still deserving. You are allowed to be progressing and still sufficient. Enoughness also reshapes relationships. When you believe you are enough, you stop seeking people who validate your insecurity. You gravitate toward those who respect your authenticity. You communicate more directly. You tolerate less manipulation. You stop overgiving to secure belonging, because belonging no longer feels conditional. Practically, this affirmation means releasing the need to earn rest. It means allowing yourself to disengage without guilt. It means speaking up without rehearsing self-doubt. It means pursuing excellence because it fulfills you, not because you fear being invisible. This does not remove ambition. It purifies it. Ambition rooted in insufficiency is frantic. Ambition rooted in enoughness is focused, calm, sustainable. The world will continue to suggest you are behind, that you need improvement before acceptance, that you must constantly optimize to deserve space. But optimization without self-acceptance never ends. There will always be another metric, another comparison, another standard. "I am enough" interrupts that cycle. It reminds you that worth precedes achievement, not the other way around. Over time, repeating this truth reshapes your internal posture. Your shoulders lower, your speech steadies, your decisions simplify. You no longer chase every external signal for confirmation. You operate from internal alignment. That alignment is quiet, but powerful. Say it tomorrow before the world begins measuring you. "I am enough," not as a shield against growth, but as a foundation beneath it. Growth built on enoughness is sustainable. Identity rooted in enoughness is stable, and a stable identity is not easily shaken by circumstance. Control feels safe. It feels responsible. It feels intelligent. If you can anticipate every outcome, plan every variable, manage every detail, then nothing will surprise you, nothing will hurt you, nothing will go wrong. That is the promise control whispers, but it is a false promise, because no matter how tightly you grip the steering wheel, there are forces on the road you cannot command. Weather changes, other drivers make decisions, roads close without warning. Life moves independently of your preferences. When you wake up and say, "I release control," you are not surrendering ambition. You are not becoming passive. You are not giving up effort. You are distinguishing between influence and domination, between participation and obsession, between responsibility and illusion. The Stoics built their philosophy on this line. Epictetus divided the world into two categories: what is within your control and what is not. Within your control are your judgments, your intentions, your actions, your responses. Outside your control is almost everything else: other people's opinions, outcomes, timing, reputation, weather, economy, past events, future events. Most suffering comes from confusing these categories. You try to control outcomes instead of focusing on effort. You try to control perception instead of focusing on character. You try to control timing instead of focusing on preparation. The result is chronic tension. You replay conversations trying to adjust how others see you. You rehearse future scenarios trying to prevent disappointment. You monitor variables that were never yours to command. And slowly, anxiety becomes your baseline. Releasing control interrupts that cycle. It says, "I will do what is mine to do, and I will let the rest unfold." This is not indifference. It is disciplined focus. Consider a goal you care deeply about. You can control your preparation. You can control your consistency. You can control your attitude. But you cannot control how quickly results appear. You cannot control market conditions. You cannot control other people's responses. When you cling to outcome, your motivation fluctuates with every external shift. When you anchor in effort, your stability increases. You become process-oriented instead of result-dependent. That shift alone reduces enormous psychological strain. There is also the relational dimension. Trying to control people rarely looks like force. It often looks like over-explaining, over-persuading, over-functioning. You carry responsibility for their choices. You absorb consequences that were never yours. You attempt to prevent lessons they must learn themselves. And when they do not change, you feel failure. I release control means allowing others to own their path. You can advise, you can support, you can set boundaries, but you cannot live their life for them. Accepting this does not eliminate care. It removes unnecessary burden. Control also attaches itself to identity timelines. You believed you would be somewhere by now, a certain level of success, stability, clarity. When reality diverges from expectation, frustration intensifies. You attempt to accelerate progress through force, longer hours, harsher self-criticism, relentless comparison. But growth has seasons. Some periods are visible expansion, others are invisible consolidation. Forcing timing often disrupts development. Seneca wrote that luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity. Preparation is yours, opportunity's arrival is not. When you release control over timing, you sustain preparation without resentment. Marcus Aurelius faced plagues, betrayals, war events far beyond personal control. Yet his writings reveal a man focused not on manipulating reality, but on mastering reaction. He reminded himself that disturbance comes not from events, but from interpretation. When you cannot control circumstance, you can still govern perception. That governance is enough. Practically, releasing control means catching the moment your mind begins spiraling into what if. It means asking, is this within my influence right now? If yes, act. If no, redirect. It means letting silence exist without filling it with anxiety. It means making a decision and accepting that perfection is impossible. It means trusting your capacity to adapt rather than your ability to predict. Releasing control softens your internal environment. Your jaw unclenches, your breath deepens, your focus narrows to what can actually be shaped. Peace emerges not because life becomes predictable, but because you stop demanding that it be. Over time, this affirmation changes your posture toward uncertainty. Uncertainty no longer feels like threat. It feels like space. Space where adaptation, creativity, and resilience operate. When you stop fighting reality, you conserve energy. That energy becomes available for growth, clarity, and presence. Say it tomorrow morning. I release control, not as defeat, but as alignment. You will still strive. You will still plan. You will still act, but you will no longer chain your peace to outcomes you cannot guarantee. And that is freedom. 5 affirmations, 5 rewiring principles. I choose my response. Growth lives here. Today matters most. I am enough. I release control. These are not motivational slogans. They are cognitive anchors. Repeat them long enough and they reshape your reflexes. Practice them consistently and they stabilize your identity. Your mind listens to what you repeat. Train it intentionally. The architecture of your inner world determines the quality of your outer experience. Rewire it deliberately.